Where are all the Pathfinder 2nd Edition video games at? What's that about? And is there anything out there to tide over your insatiable hunger for a PF2e video game? This is the Dominomicon, authored and hosted by me, Dominic. The Dominomicon is dedicated to all nerdy things, with my current obsession being the TTRPG Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In this video chapter, we're going to be trying something a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about why I believe there aren't many PF2e video games out there, based on some things I've researched on the web and based on some speculation from someone who has many years of playing and following video games, including their development cycles. I do want to stress, however, that this isn't necessarily factual and is based on my thoughts and ideas on a situation, so you may need to take what I say with a pinch of salt. The footage you'll be seeing in the background will be from some of the games I'll mention close to the end, and if you find this video chapter informative or helpful, please give it a like and consider subscribing so I can keep on going. Let's dive in. Go music, go! First things first, PF2e is probably the best tactical combat TTRPG I have ever played. It's incredibly well balanced, rewards thoughtful decisions, has a ludicrous amount of character build options, includes a stupid amount of content, has some really interesting lore, and is just a boatload of fun on top of all that. PF2e should work amazingly well as a CRPG or computer role-playing games for those not in the know, especially a turn-based one. The system lends itself almost perfectly with a video game and genuinely should work exceedingly well as one. But chances are, if you're watching this video, you already know all that. And chances are that you're also as disappointed about the lack of PF2e video games as I am. So why aren't there many PF2e video games out there if these things are the case? Well, after a decent amount of research over the years, I've come up with a few potential reasons as to why. 1. PF2e is still relatively new. So while the system itself has been around for around 5.5 years as of the release of this video chapter, that's still quite fresh for a video game adaptation to be made based on it. This is because, first of all, a development studio, especially one that could make a relatively large video game, is a business. And if they're going to start a project, they kind of need to know that they're going to make a profit from it because of how long it takes to actually create a video game. It's like baking a cake that literally sits in the oven for a few years. If halfway through you realize that everyone hates what you're baking, well, it's in the oven now, and you've already bought and used the ingredients, so you're kind of screwed. And CRPGs in particular can take up to 6-ish years to make. You only need to look to Baldur's Gate 3 to see this long development time. So for a PF2e CRPG to be made realistically, it would have had to have started development 3 to 4 years ago to be released anytime soon. And at that point, PF2e was still in its infancy, and trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing and whether or not the system would ultimately become successful or not was practically impossible. So a development studio is not going to risk beginning to create a video game based on a system that isn't necessarily beloved. And that brings us neatly to number 2. PF2e's playtest turned off some Pathfinder fans. I won't go into the specifics because that could be a whole video, but the PF2e playtest had questionable design decisions that really turned off some potential customers. Almost all of these disliked decisions were removed for the actual launch of PF2e as a testament to how much Paizo actually listened to the player base. Other companies would do well to attempt the same thing, really. And the actual system was very well liked when it actually did release. Still, some people, especially Pathfinder 1st Edition players, disliked the playtest and also didn't want to abandon a system that they had bought into for years. Pathfinder 1st Edition had been around for a literal decade, with all those years of content being added to an already content-rich system due to it being based off of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. So if you were a video game developer and wanted to make a CRPG roughly 3 or 4 years ago, unless you happen to be a die-hard PF2e fan already, somehow despite it being a new and not all that popular system in comparison to something like D&D and PF1e, there's just no realistic way you'd even glance over a PF2e, especially if you had tried and disliked the playtest or had heard about the issues it had. But time's arrow marches forward, and over the last few years, PF2e has grown in popularity and the scale of the system has become something to behold. But then we get to the next issue. Number 3, game system complexity. PF2e is extremely well designed with lots of rules and maths to make it all work so well. Initially, coding a video game based on such a well-designed rule set seems easy, but when you start to dive deeper into the ifs and ors of the system, you start to realize how tricky that stuff would actually be to nail down as a video game. I don't mean to say that it's too complex or that it's impossible to create, quite the contrary. and I imagine that PF2e's excellent design should make some parts of development for a video game version actually somewhat simple to accomplish. And games like Pathfinder, Kingmaker, and Wrath of the Righteous already exist that are based on extremely complex game systems, though PF1e had already garnered a lot of community support by the time these games were in development. Still, getting all these systems to work together as intended with the sheer amount of choices you have in PF2e would be a development challenge, hence why it's easier to just make a game other than a CRPG based on PF2e, and that's why one of those already exists. It's just a rather large and complex task that would take years to accomplish, also bearing in mind how well balanced the system is and how translating that into a video game without a GM is a difficult task in of itself, especially when it hasn't already been done with the PF2e system specifically. Balancing out all of the potential issues with a new system might be something that dev studios wouldn't want to risk, again, once that cake is in the oven. But let's move on to the fourth problem, the market and saturation. Baldur's Gate 3 has utterly dominated the CRPG scene, and with good reason, and lots of other video game developers will be looking to the things that made that game so successful and trying to replicate that. Many large video game companies are, sadly, likely to misunderstand what made a game so popular and try to copy-paste some of that success in their own way, usually to poor effect. Just ask Ubisoft on that front. Thus, many companies will be looking to Wizards of the Coast at the moment and trying to nab some bits and pieces so they can have a piece of the pie along with Larian Studios. Also, just the fact that D&D is so popular right now means that Pathfinder's world Golarion is probably seen as second best, and who wants a CRPG set in a world that might be second best? And who is going to put that vast amount of time and money into something like that? For what it's worth, I genuinely much prefer Pathfinder lore over D&D lore and think that a game set in Golarion can be fascinating if done right, as there's a crazy amount of information from a very interesting world to draw that lore from. But the bigger video game developers still might not be looking to Pathfinder and Paizo to make a CRPG based on the system due to Baldur's Gate 3's success, and instead may just want to rehash what Larian Studios did with the popular intellectual property that is Dungeons & Dragons. With all that said, however, the chances of more CRPGs being made in general is definitely higher now than it has been for a long time, but that's only as of the last couple of years. And Owlcat Games have proven with Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous that people do like games set in Paizo's Golarion, even if those games were released before Baldur's Gate 3. Speaking of Paizo, my last reason for why we don't have all that many PF2e video games yet? Licensing. From my research, internally, Paizo probably do want a big PF2e CRPG to be made, but licensing is just another potential hurdle for larger video game development companies to jump over. For smaller studios specifically, using an already established IP can come with significant advantages, and Paizo tend to be keen on partnerships, which would probably make this process even easier for these types of companies. But the point here is that it's still another layer of extra work that needs to be done when you consider that these companies could just hire someone to develop a decent RPG system that would probably end up being a lot cheaper in the long run than having to share profits with another company. It's all about money, remember, and often these big AAA publishers wouldn't want to share a single penny with another company if they can avoid it. The good news here is that with the Orc license now in play, making a video game using the PF2e license should be potentially a bit easier due to it reducing legal complexities or offering more flexible terms, and this once again increases the chances of us getting a PF2e CRPG. So all of these reasons tell us one thing: the big reason that there hasn't been a relatively large CRPG using PF2e system is time. And I don't mean entropy in like an existential sort of dark version of time. I just mean that there's simply not been enough time for a CRPG to be made using a system that is this new. But that does mean that overall, the chances of us getting a game like this are actually higher now than they've ever been. It's been enough time for a video game studio to see how fantastic and popular PF2e is, and with Paizo's continued fantastic development of the system, licensing, and their generally very favorable reputation amongst TTRPG players and GMs, now is as good a time as any to actually begin development of a PF2e CRPG, hopefully set in Pathfinder's amazing world of Golarion. So I reckon that in the next few years, we'll probably start to see a few PF2e video games pop up, hopefully CRPGs. In the meantime though, there's a few games out there you can play right now to help satisfy your PF2e CRPG itch. I'll briefly go over them now, though I imagine most of my viewers are already aware of these games. And as ever, I'll have links in the description to each and every one of them. Dawnsbury Days is an actual CRPG CRPG based on the PF2e system, though it's extremely indie, meaning that it was made by one person and has rather rudimentary art and the like, and it's a pretty short game with a level cap only being 4. Though some would say that this all adds to the charm of the game itself. If anything, it's more of a proof of concept that a PF2e video game can actually be created and can function well, and I'd recommend this over anything else if you just want a PF2e CRPG to play right now. There are some cool mods in the Steam Workshop to expand on the game, and the developer does update and add more classes, etc. to the game as time goes on. Honestly, playing it just makes me realize how amazing a AA or AAA PF2e CRPG would be, and props to the dev for making such a fun game. Honestly, I don't think people should be sleeping on this game, as it's kind of ludicrously fun, and I highly recommend just giving it a try. Even just playing around in the combat scenarios is so much fun. And there's DLC on the way to increase level cap to 8, plus more story content, etc. It's well worth your time and money, in my opinion. Aside from that, Divinity Original Sin 2 has a similar sort of action economy to PF2e, and is a turn-based CRPG from Larian Studios, the same guys that made Baldur's Gate 3. Obviously, it's not set in Golarion or anything, but it can kind of scratch that tactical CRPG itch, and there's loads of mods to make it more balanced and even more fun. And if you just simply want to play a turn-based or real-time with pause game set in Golarion, Pathfinder Kingmaker and Wrath of the Righteous by Owlcat Games are there, even if it's Pathfinder 1st edition and not 2nd edition. The games are rather large with a crazy amount of class build options, and they go all the way to level 20, and they're crazy moddable too. It's a bit of a shame that Owlcat Games chose not to make a PF2e CRPG, but hey, you never know, they might do it at some point. That's about it for video games that are similar to Pathfinder 2nd edition, but there is an upcoming game that somewhat recently got announced to be in development called Dragon's Demand. It's based on a Pathfinder 1st edition module of the same name, though this will obviously be PF2e. It's already been rather successfully kickstarted, so now it's just a waiting game until the game releases, which is currently estimated as November 2026. The game has a sort of board game aesthetic and is being developed by some of the people that worked on some expansions or DLCs to Neverwinter Nights 1 and 2, and looks to be a bit larger in scale than Dawnsbury Days, so that one is on its way at least. Until then, unfortunately, all we can do is sit and wait and carry on showing our support for Pathfinder 2nd edition. Hopefully one day a relatively large video games developer will come forward and actually try to make a CRPG based on this lovely system. I genuinely think that we're probably going to see more PF2e CRPGs in the next few years, though whether or not they'll be small games, large games, successful or unsuccessful remains to be seen. What do you think though, my beautiful loyal viewers? Do you think we'll see a Pathfinder 2nd edition CRPG before long? Or do you know something that we don't perhaps? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll try to respond to each and every one of you. And as ever, if you liked the video or found it helpful or informative, please give it a like and consider subscribing. I genuinely appreciate each and every one of you. But that's it for this video chapter. This is Dominic of the Dominomicon wishing you a fond farewell, and until next time, goodbye.